The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and today I am very pleased to welcome back to the show for the first time in quite some time, the very lovely Annie Whitehead. Annie, welcome back.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's nice to talk to you again.
Oh, it's so nice to see your face and hear your voice again. And the last time I had you on the show, we talked about some of the women in Anglo-Saxon England, which was such a fun topic. And that book came out in what did you say, 2020?
2020, yeah.
Yeah, and that was fantastic. So that is one of those things I'm going to link in the show notes. So if people want to go back and listen to that episode as well, they can do that. But today I have you on the show because you have a new book out or coming out that is called Murder in Anglo-Saxon England. And when I saw that this was your new book and I saw the title, I thought I really have to talk to her about this because what a fascinating subject. What intrigued you or what inspired you really to write this book?
Yeah, well, I mean, it's quite a grisly subject, and it's not, I'm not known for writing crime novels or anything like that, but I just started to notice that there were an awful lot of stories about murder in Anglo-Saxon England, and I knew that a lot of them just weren't true. And a lot of them are connected with some of the women that I wrote about in my last nonfiction book, who were primarily really remembered for having been murderesses or having incited murders. And so I knew from my previous research that these stories just weren't true. And I thought, oh, wouldn't it be a great idea to gather all these stories and to talk about them and all the, the interesting and the really gruesome detail in some cases, but then also examine them and think about, how true are they? What were the reasons that these stories came to us? Who was writing those stories down? And what kind of agenda were they following? So, yeah, and as I dug deeper and deeper, it just got even more and more interesting. And it sounds awful, it really does, but I had such a good time writing it. I really did.
I love that. Yeah, sometimes we get into these interesting little topics that pique our interest and we start diving a little bit deeper into it and these amazing stories come out of it. And your book is just a showcase of that. And one of the things I want to mention real quick before we get deeper into the topic of your book is that you primarily write about pre-conquest England, which I think is fascinating. And obviously for this podcast, it's not something that we cover very often, but it is a subject that I'm interested in. And I think it's so important to learn about these early parts of English history because it does eventually affect the Tudors, right? Like all history. I just think it's fascinating that this is the topic that you've chosen to write and research about.
Yeah, well, I mean, I do love this portion of medieval history because nowadays the tendency is to call it the early medieval period. But for me, that's almost as misleading as calling it the Anglo-Saxon period. And there are issues with that. But early medieval, yes, they were medieval, as in, pre-Tudors, pre-modern era, but so different in so many ways because of the line that 1066 drew across history, essentially. And they were speaking a different language from their later medieval counterparts. They had different laws. That's something that I looked at in detail in the book. They had different customs. Women had a lot more rights and different rights. So it's a little bit tricky for me, but there are things that link. We can sort of straddle that line of 1066 because, of course, the language that you and I are talking right now is not derived from Old Norman or Old French. It is mainly derived from Old English. So there were things that did survive. So, there is a connection. And I always like to say that the main thing that I love to compare with this era and the Tudor era is that is that those are the two occasions in English history until modern, well, not even then, I don't think it ever happened again. Oh yeah, once in Stuart England, that a woman ruler succeeded a woman ruler. And you only have that happening in 10th century Mercia, which was one of the English kingdoms, and then not again until Tudor times. So there are slight links, but I think with all history, the more you learn, the more you understand how we got to where we are today. So the more periods that you can look at and hopefully be interested in, the better, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. So, with this different language that is not the one that we speak today, what kind of challenges did that throw at you as a researcher for something like this?
I mean, luckily there are lots of good translations, and my Old English is not that great that I can rely purely on the written documents. And also, a lot of them were written in Latin anyway, so
Okay.
that's a whole other different skill. But we do have, surprisingly, because sometimes this Anglo-Saxon era is also called the early medieval era, and it's also, was known for a long time as the Dark Ages. And it's because it was always considered that there weren't a lot of sources and a lot of surviving materials, but actually there's a lot more than people might imagine. So we have a lot of surviving law codes and charters and wills and other written documents, written histories, some of which, most of them were written in Latin with little bits of Old English added in. So yeah, we rely heavily on translations, or I do my own rough translations and then get an expert to check that what I've done is okay.
One of the things that you mentioned while we were just talking was how the laws were different for women. Can we touch base on that? Because I think that's fascinating.
Yeah, so I think most people would be surprised to learn that women had an awful lot of power and agency. I mean, obviously, I'm talking about the top layer of society. I mean, it wasn't quite the same for, the ordinary, what we might class the working person, but certainly the top level of society. They had a lot of freedoms, really. And going right back to the earliest part of the period in the 7th century, the first Christian monasteries were all established by women, royal women, who then became abbesses, and one of them was actually responsible for educating 5 bishops. So, they were playing a really, really important role in society. Women, by law, maybe, only in theory and perhaps not in practice, did have a lot of say about whom they married.
Hmm.
And, we have a document that suggests that, a would-be bridegroom not only had to ask the bride's father for his permission, but also the bride. And if she wasn't happy about the marriage, then it didn't happen. They were allowed to, whatever they took into the marriage, they took out again. They were allowed to divorce, and if they did, then the provisions were made for them to keep the children, and if the husband wanted to keep the children, he had to compensate them. So you're far removed from this idea that women throughout history, really, and right up to Victorian times, I suppose, were always either unable or unwilling to divorce because they would lose their children, because the children belonged to the father. That's not the case in Anglo-Saxon England. Women held land in their own right. They were able to bequeath it to whomever they wanted to. So there was a lot more freedom and a lot more, I wouldn't go so far as to say equality necessarily, but perhaps more than we might imagine. And I think a lot of that did change with the Norman conquest. So this idea that a medieval wife was just part of the husband's goods and chattels, it wasn't necessarily true for, pre-conquest England.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That pre-conquest, it seemed so much more. I don't know if the word I want to use is liberal, but I think that's really interesting. Okay, so let's talk about the murders, right? I want to know. Let's start out with what was the most interesting story that you came across while doing the research for this?
Oh gosh, that's a difficult one. I mean, there's so many. Again, it's going to sound weird if I use them, but lovely stories.
Right?
A lot of them fell into very similar categories. So there's a lot of stories about infanticide, children being killed, usually because they were a threat to somebody who wanted their throne potentially. One story I do love, which is an abbess of Mercia who apparently was so jealous of her little baby brother who had inherited their father's kingdom, that she arranged to have this little boy taken quietly out and murdered. And the later story that we get about this is that she would have been fine had a dove not dropped a message over the altar of St. Peter's Church in Rome, saying what had happened and where the body could be found. So she was discovered, and she saw the funeral procession coming back to the abbey for her brother's burial, and she started chanting a psalm backwards as a kind of a spell. And according to an Anglo-Norman chronicler who was telling us the story, her eyeballs then spontaneously fell out. And he said that when he was writing, even in his day, you could still see the blood spatters on the psalter that she'd been reading from. And it's so lovely and juicy and gory, and it's probably not true at all, because we have no evidence whatsoever that this little brother even existed. So and I do love that story because it's a classic example of how the later chroniclers not only embellished the stories, but also liked, for various reasons, to put the women at the heart of these stories and to blame them. And like I said, there is absolutely no evidence. She might have had a brother, and if that's the case, he probably just predeceased their father, and that was all there was to it. But somehow this story just grew and became this, this awful thing. And there are quite a few very similar stories, and yeah, I just love them. The women always tend to be accused of murder by someone else's hand. So they're always hands off, and they're using poison quite often, because that's traditionally a woman's weapon of choice, or they're paying some henchman to do their dirty work for them. And it's a classic. There's another story that a kinswoman, actually, another queen this time of Mercia, who became an abbess. She was the wife of King Offa, and he had a rival king of East Anglia beheaded. But again, one of the versions of the story is that it was all his wife's idea, and she suggested this to her husband and said, God has delivered into your hands your enemy, so take the opportunity. And the king said, no, absolutely not. And so she arranged for it to go ahead. And another repeating theme really is that a pit was dug, and the visiting king fell into it, and then he was disposed of. And again, you get this idea that it's this evil woman that's done this bad stuff. And the earlier sources, the more contemporary sources, don't blame her at all. And we've got correspondence from a very active religious scholar who was at the Emperor Charlemagne's court, who was writing to her and to her son and telling her son that he should learn compassion from his mother. So the contemporary sources don't blame her at all. Again, it's the later sources that embellish this tale, and we've got a pit, and we have columns of white light showing where the victims' bodies can be found. And actually, this woman, when we look at the contemporary evidence, she was a very, very capable, almost, we think, maybe a co-ruler with her husband, because she had coins minted in her own name. She's the only Anglo-Saxon woman we know of who had this, and we think it might be because she was ruling part of Offa's dominions for him. Yeah. So the contemporary evidence really doesn't stack up against this later story, but it is a great story again, and it's just that's what I love doing with the book, is just looking at the earliest sources and what they tell us, and then what the later ones tended to tell us, and trying to work out who might be actually telling the truth. But yeah, those are two stories that I just love. They're great. They're really what's the word I'm looking for? Salacious, I think.
That's a good word. Why do you think it is? When we look at Tudor history and we look at the sources that come out a century later, we know why people are telling those stories. So why do you think it is that these non-contemporary stories that come out about these women paint them in such a negative light. What changed in society, do you think, that caused this shift, or was it just purely political?
I think it was a little bit political and a little bit religious because, by and large, with one notable exception, the stories that we have of these terrible, evil women come to us from the later Anglo-Norman chroniclers. So they're writing post 1066. Some of them made a point of saying that they really admired some of the Anglo-Saxon kings, but others they weren't very impressed by. And of course, they're writing to a different audience. They're wanting to, shall we say, not look back on the Anglo-Saxon era with any admiration or fondness generally, because, you know, that was then and this is now. And, you know, the conquest was completely legal and legitimate and righteous. So there is that sort of political aspect, but also religion. Everything had sort of shifted around about the 12th century. Church attitudes towards women have changed, and we've moved a long way from the days when abbesses were completely in charge. And in the early days, those early monasteries, they were what was called double houses. So they were nuns and monks living in the same sort of complex, not necessarily all together. Sometimes they were separate buildings, but in the same complex, and the women were in charge. And those had kind of fallen away, and gradually they became presided over by men, you know, by the priests. And so it's a subtle shift, I think. And there is this sort of general trope that, you know, that the women are, they're the temptresses, they are the weaker vessel. And it's something that was being reinforced, I think, in these later centuries, that again, you know, and I do think it's probably comes as a surprise, not so much in the Anglo-Saxon era. It just wasn't that same kind of attitude in a lot of cases. So the earlier we get to the source, to the event, you know, the less sensational the reports seem to be. And it's these later, and remember that all these Anglo-Norman chroniclers are monks, first and foremost. And what's really interesting for me is the one who gives us the story about King Offa's wife being the one who instigated the murder. They were kind of bigging King Offa up because he founded St Albans, and he was a sort of patron of St Alban. And the monk who gave us this story was known as Roger of Wendover, which doesn't seem to stack up, or, you know, you don't make any connections until you find out that Roger of Wendover, that's where he was from. Where he was a monk was at the Abbey of St Albans. So, you know, when he's writing his history, of course, he's going to, you know, focus on the good things that Offa did. And, you know, if we know this murder happened, so who we're going to blame? We're going to blame the wife. You know, we can't blame our patron, you know, our founder. So, yeah, it's working out exactly who's got the motivation, not for the murder, but for writing the story as they write it.
Fascinating. So basically, what I'm hearing you say is we have William the Conqueror to thank for destroying the reputation of these women, taking away the freedoms, right?
Well, I'm happy to blame William for almost everything. So, yeah.
One of the things that I've always found really fascinating, and I would love for you to talk about this, is how the kings, and I don't know, did they even call them kings back then, or were they just lower? Okay, so the kings back then, like how cutthroat it was and how frequently they got murdered.
Ooh, so much.
I know.
So much. But it's in the earliest period. So the first few chapters of the book are really about kings, quite often coming back from exile, taking over the territory and then being killed with alarming frequency in some cases. So Northumbria, which is the northeastern kingdom, in the 8th century, so many kings either being killed or driven into exile or one lovely thing, one way, quite a peaceful way, if you like, of getting rid of your rival is that some of these kings and would-be claimants to the throne were what's called forcibly tonsured. In other words, they were tonsured, and that meant that they had to take the religious life, or they were considered to be monks from there on, and therefore, as religious men, could not then claim the throne. So this is quite a good way of sort of neutralizing your rival. So there was a lot of that going on. There's tales of sons of kings being dragged out of sanctuary in churches and murdered, and noblemen being burned inside their own halls. And so the history of 8th century Northumbria is just a catalogue of all of this. The trouble is, we don't have enough information to understand really what was going on, because we don't have written law codes for Northumbria. So there's not a whole lot of written evidence. There's not an awful lot of contemporary evidence. But we do know that the churchmen were absolutely wringing their hands in despair. I mentioned one scholar, his name was Alcuin, and he was a Northumbrian, and he was, say, living with the Emperor Charlemagne, serving Charlemagne at his court. But he was writing, he was a prolific letter writer, and he was just in despair. And the church felt that the famous so-called first Viking raid on Lindisfarne in 793 was God's way of punishing the Northumbrians for the way they were behaving. But I think as time goes on, the murder stories change in nature and in essence, and it's not kings constantly being killed. But what we have to think about, in the 7th century and in the 8th century, these kingdoms were still really being formed. So, you know, the Angles and the Saxons and the Jutes and the Frisians and everybody else had come across and were gradually, there's still a lot of debate as to how violent or otherwise this sort of invasion or takeover was, but they were gradually extending and expanding their territories into what were known as the old British kingdoms or the old Brittonic kingdoms. And so we need to see it all as part of establishing kingship and forgetting about the idea of dynasty, really, because it was a long time before the kings really were able to establish this idea that son succeeded father, and we don't question it, because it never really did happen until the 10th century. And even then, it wasn't sort of enshrined by law. It wasn't a given that a son would succeed a father. So you've got all these, quite violent men, obviously violent, just really jockeying for position and for control. And we see this sort of, it's almost like a chicken and egg situation where strong kings seemed then to be able to have a strong foreign policy and gain extra land and therefore wealth, because if they gained extra land from other kingdoms, other territories, they could put them under tribute, and tribute would come in the form of, say, livestock as well as coin. So the question I had to ask was it that strong kings were able to establish themselves in their own territories and then expand the kingdom, which meant that they were stronger and held on to power? Or was it the ones who were strong at the outset, who could demonstrate that they could gain extra territory, that then meant they didn't face so many challenges from within? So, you know, it was kind of interesting to look at that and see what was going on. But yeah, the early part of the story is definitely an awful lot of that. You know, kings just being killed, looking around and thinking, oh, well, that guy's pretty old, but, you know, his son's quite young and virile. I think I'd need to. And it's not pitched battles. I don't think it was one-to-one fighting. I think it was probably just the kings and their immediate sort of retainers and their hearth troops. But there's an awful lot of skullduggery going on, you know, and tricks and betrayals. And one king who was, or one would-be king, I would say, who was ordered to be killed, and whoever done the job didn't quite do it properly, and this guy's body was brought into the cathedral, and he recovered.
Oh no!
And years later, he actually did become king. And the churchmen who were writing at the time reminded him of that and said, take this as a warning, live a good life, be a good king. Not so much. So, yeah, it really was a struggle to just establish these kingdoms. And yeah, it's at some points it's quite difficult to just keep tabs on, it must almost have been like, what day of the week is it? Who's king today? It's that kind of thing.
Yeah, exactly. Without a defined succession, as when we go to the 16th century, it's very clear cut, right? Here are the family members who will succeed me. I can't imagine what it was like to live during a time where there wasn't that, where it was so cutthroat. And at the same time, you have the Danes invading.
Yes, yeah. Which interestingly, when I come to that, because the book is kind of laid out chronologically, so we just go through the centuries from the 7th to the 11th, and the period where there's an awful lot of Viking activity, not so much domestic murder going on, because I think people had other things to worry about, and obviously the chroniclers are concentrating on what was going on with the Viking invaders. So it did calm down a little bit from that point, but it still gives us some really good things to talk about. So of course the famous blood eagle sacrifice, which one of the kings of Northumbria was supposedly subjected to. So I mean maybe fun is the wrong word, but it was very interesting to research what actually might have been involved in the whole blood eagle process and whether it is anatomically possible to do that to someone.
Oh, well, now you have to go into depth on this a little bit more now. Tell us more about this blood eagle thing.
Well, it depends. There's one tiny verse of a sort of a poem. The trouble is with the Viking history, so little, even less, was written down. So we rely on the later sagas. But there is just one little verse, and it talks about the process. But as I discovered, it depends on how you translate or you interpret what is said. And so it could all be symbolic. That's the thing. And the idea of the blood eagle, where there's sort of, the back is ripped open and the lungs are pulled through the ribs and the ribs are splayed, and it's vile, really.
Yeah.
But we're not sure because it might all be based on a misinterpretation of this verse. But, and I have detailed it in the book with the reference, that some medical scientists actually looked at how the process might have happened to see whether it could be done and keep the victim alive until, almost the end. And apparently it would. In the right hands, the skilled hands, if somebody knew what they were doing, it is possible, awful as it sounds, for the victim to survive for almost all of the process. And it's really, really gruesome. Yeah.
Yeah. Was that the most gruesome story that you came across?
I think in terms of actually making me flinch while I was reading about it, yes. But there was some other real horror stories. And there's a whole chapter about the St. Brice's Day massacre, which for me was chilling because, and I do say this in the book, it's so easy to just casually talk about, oh, this king was killed or that king was killed. Sometimes it's when you're faced with the I'll try and say that again, archaeological evidence, that you start to remember that these were real people, real lives, and some of them died in horrific circumstances. And the St. Brice's Day massacre is a classic example of that, where we have the written evidence, contemporary, and we also have the archaeological evidence. And in a nutshell, what happened was some Danes in Oxford were chased down by the local townsfolk and killed. And the story went that the church where they sought sanctuary was then set on fire.
Oh.
And we know the essence of this story is true because the king who ordered it, Ethelred the Unready, he set down in a later charter sort of refounding this church and explaining why he was doing it, because on his orders the Danes had been killed and the church had been destroyed. And it's open to interpretation. He issued the decree that all the Danes in England should be killed. And we don't, by this time in the 11th century, when he was king, there were so many Danes who'd settled and, sort of second, third generation, and lots of intermarriages. So we don't think that it was meant to be all of them. And depending on the sources, some say it was just the men, some say it was men, women and children. But again, it's the later ones that say, it talks about babies being dashed against walls and all this kind of horrific stuff. Yeah. But we know that this did happen because the king ordered it and then set out in a charter that, yes, he had ordered it done. But then the archaeological evidence, there was some excavation done at the site and loads of skeletons were found. But the really chilling aspect for me was that a lot of these skeletons showed signs of having been burnt. There was charring on the bones. So, and suddenly you're faced you're not just reading some document. You're looking at the evidence that these people were real and they were there and this really happened to them. So that, that was a kind of stop and take a moment,
Yeah. Some of those stories, they're hard to hear, but they're also so interesting, aren't they?
Yes, they are. And especially when you try and put them back in the context of what was going on at the time. Ethelred was up against renewed Viking raids. So it may be that he was concerned about a particular band of foreigners in this particular place. Maybe he'd got some intelligence that something was in the offing. So it's really interesting to sort of take a step back and say, well, what was going on at this time? And of course, lots of unexplained and very convenient deaths as well, which I've looked into a little bit, because I think nobody's saying that this was murder, but the only person that benefited was the person who then took over from this dead person, who probably should have expected to be able to live a little bit longer than, say, 18 years or 19 years, and how often agreements were come to where the kingdom was split. We've been fighting for a while, I'll rule this bit, you rule that bit, and 3-4 weeks later, sometimes not even that, one half of that agreement was suddenly very conveniently dead, and you think, that was lucky.
Lucky, right? Exactly. Well, I'm curious too. How many other murderesses did you talk about in this book?
Oh, there's a few of them. So I say I've mentioned 2 of them.
Yeah.
Now, King Offa's wife had 4 daughters, and unfortunately one of them also gained a reputation as being a murderess. And she's the one I mentioned that we do have a pre-conquest source for her shenanigans. And this was actually a biographer of King Alfred the Great. There's a monk called Asa who was living in Alfred's court, and he wrote a biography. So, very contemporary, because he wrote it while Alfred was still alive. And he talked about this daughter of King Offa, who was married to a king of Wessex, a king of the West Saxons. And apparently she was so jealous of the king's advisors that she tried to poison one of them. And unfortunately, the king took the poison first, drank from the cup first. So it was a kind of a twofer. She wanted to kill the advisor, and she ended up killing the king as well. And then, according to Asa, she then stole all the kingdom's treasures and fled to the continent and took refuge in Charlemagne's court. And he set her up in an abbey on the continent. And that wasn't the end of her story, because she was then caught in debauchery and ended up being thrown out of the convent and died in poverty. And Asa tells us that her story is the reason why, from that point onwards, the wives of the kings of Wessex were no longer given the title of queen, because she had disgraced the name, essentially. So again, it's a fabulous story. I don't think any of it's true, because the king that she was married to had a strange name for a West Saxon king, and his name was Beatrich, which is very, very similar to a lot of other Mercian royal family names. And Offa, her father, and Beatrich, her husband, had worked together to drive a king of Wessex, or a would-be king of Wessex, into exile. This guy came back from exile, and there was actually a battle. And in that battle, I think, looking, if you read between the lines, the way it's laid out in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that's where King Beatrich was killed, in battle. And if we assume that that's what happened, then this poor lady's flight with all the treasures that she can gather kind of takes on a different slant, because it may be her husband's dead on the battlefield. The guy who killed him in battle was the one that her husband and her father drove into exile. Is she going to want to hang around and find out how merciful he's going to be? Or is she going to gather up enough treasure so that she can sort of live, support herself, and get away as quickly as possible? So I tend to think that that's what happened. And the story about West Saxon queen consorts no longer being given the title of queen, actually, we can demonstrate that that's not true, because it was a title given to other queen consorts, even in Asa's lifetime. So he would have known that. But crucially, one of the ones who was given that title was the wife of, from a different branch of Alfred's family. So Alfred's older brother had been king before him and had two small children when he died, who were too young to be king. But as they grew up, this side of the family potentially presented a threat. So there's no reason why Asa would have wanted to make anyone take notice of that, so he would play down any other than the immediate branch of the family that he was being paid to write about. So I think when we look at what was going on in Wessex with Alfred's family and potential rival claims, and also that we know there was a battle, and the thing that ties both those sides of the story together is that this King of Wessex, who came back from exile and killed King Beatrich on the battlefield, was Alfred the Great's grandfather. So, and again, we look at what Asa was being paid to do, who's he paid to big up. It all kind of makes sense that he's going to dismiss anything and anyone but this exiled king who was Alfred's grandfather, and then Alfred's reign as well. So yeah, there's a lot of detective work to see, not necessarily the motives for the murders, but as I think I said earlier, the motives for the people who are writing about them. So she was great. We do have one other poisoner, murderess, and she was a 10th century queen. She was actually Ethelred the Unready's mother. She was a consecrated queen. She was the first consecrated queen, and she's got a terrible reputation because an unfortunate thing happened when she was widowed, and that is her stepson briefly became king. And if I tell you that his name was Edward the Martyr, you get a fair idea what happened to him.
Yeah.
And the story was that he was murdered in the presence of his stepmother, and also probably at her instigation. Now, I'm not going to deny she had everything to gain, because once Edward was dead, her son Ethelred then became king. And he did make a point throughout his reign of, he understood that he could have been blamed for the murder, or, it was done on his behalf. And so his brother Edward became a saint and was remembered as a martyr very, very quickly. So there is that. I'm not saying she didn't gain from it, but there is a fantastic story about her, and I mean literally fantastic, that she was a witch. And an abbot came across her one day, and she was practicing witchcraft, and obviously she didn't want him to tell anyone. So she ordered him killed. And the method that was employed was that he was stabbed with hot knives in his armpits, so that the wounds wouldn't show, so that nobody would know.
Oh my.
And it's another great story, but we have to balance this against what we know about her. And her husband, King Edgar, was famous for instigating or helping the so-called monastic Reformation. This was when the monasteries and the abbeys were sort of ordered to get back to following the rule of St. Benedict and living a bit more, out with the married clerks and in with the celibate monks and all this kind of thing. And a rule book was written down, and it, basically rules for how the monks should live according to the rule of St. Benedict. And it was written or commissioned by one of the leading lights of the Reformation, Bishop Athelwold, and he dedicated part of it to this queen, saying that she was the I can't remember the exact phrase, but the sentinel or something. That her idea was that she was the spiritual advisor for all the nuns in England. So we know that about her. We also know that she was a legal advocate. So people were bringing lawsuits for various things, and women particularly were bringing lawsuits, and the Queen was essentially speaking in court on their behalf. So she was this consecrated queen. She was valued highly by one of the leading bishops in the country, who supported her to the very end. And she was doing this sort of legal work. She was known as a foraspreaker, literally a forespeaker, speaking for or on behalf of someone in legal disputes. So again, we have to sort of balance what we know with what we hear. It is interesting that nobody was ever punished for Edward's killing, and really somebody should have been, and it was all kind of hushed up. But it doesn't mean that she knew it was going to happen, and it doesn't mean that she ordered it. It might just have been done by people who supported her son. We've got no concrete evidence that she was complicit, so I'd like to give her the benefit of the doubt. But yeah, she was, poor woman, she was remembered as a murderess and a witch and a poisoner, and I'm not convinced, really.
Is it any surprise? I don't think it's any different than today, where women in power are demonized one way or another, aren't they?
Yeah, it does seem to be, sadly. And of course, we have to remember that in almost all these cases where we know the names of the chroniclers, they were men. Mm-hmm. Now, women were definitely working in scriptoriums. We know that. But, the sort of but where we can put a name to the chronicles, it's always the men, and always religious men, because by and large it was only the monks who could write. So and writing, as I say, writing and reading, completely different skills. Most noble women were literate, and we have evidence of this. Most noblemen would be. It makes sense. Even the abbesses who were ruling these vast estates, they would have needed to be able to read the charters that were being issued about the lands that they owned or the lands that they governed. So we think that most of the top tier of society could read, but that doesn't mean they could write. It was a completely separate skill, and they would have got somebody else to write for them. And it's quite possible that those working in the scriptoriums who were just copying things also didn't know what they were copying. But the chroniclers who were actually writing these histories, obviously they could write and read, and they were, as I say, the ones we know of were all men, and they were all religious men as well. So again, there's going to be a slightly different angle that they're coming from.
I have to go back because you mentioned the women working in these scriptoriums. I'm fascinated by that. So you think they were the ones that were just copying? They didn't know exactly what they were writing?
Probably. I mean, they might have done. We don't know. But as I say, they are two completely different skills. There's a lot of archaeological evidence from Whitby Abbey, which was one of the very early ones. And that's where future bishops were educated, it was said. And we know that the nuns were working there on translations of works. The Life of St. Gregory was one of the ones that they were working on. And they found lots of styli, the stylus that they used to write in the wax tablets. So and book clasps and things. So we know there was probably a big library there. And yes, I think probably a lot of the abbeys where there were just nuns would have had their own scriptorium. There's a lovely case. It's not actually from this country, but it was quite a recent discovery. The blue-toothed nun, as she was called, was a skeleton, and she had blue teeth. And for a while, this was a bit of a puzzle. And then they worked out that she had been working in a scriptorium, and she'd been using a paintbrush to do some of the illuminations, working with lapis lazuli and licking her paintbrush. And that stained her teeth. So, again, it's just fantastic when we get these archaeological finds that just confirm what the written sources tell us, or even add to our understanding. So, yeah, it's a wonderful story. I love that, the blue-toothed nun.
I love that too. Many people don't know this, but maybe people who have listened to the show from the beginning know that archaeology was like my first obsession as a kid. And I just think it's so important to combine the research from archaeology with the history that we know, because it does really fill in all the gaps, doesn't it?
Oh, it does, absolutely. One without the other is pretty useless. Because when you combine the two, you get the context and the understanding that comes with that. Yeah.
Yeah, I love I love history. So I am curious, Annie, if there were any stories that you came across that didn't make it into the book that you want to share with the audience.
I don't think so, because ultimately there aren't that many. And I was quite pleased. I think there's around about 100 cases, not victims, because obviously a lot of times there were multiple victims, as with the St. Brice's Day massacre that I talked about earlier. But around about 100 cases, which, considering the dates of the book, it's 626 to 1076. It's a long time. It's statistically not. I mean, these are the ones that we know about, and as I say, a few that I suspect as well. And I looked at the law codes in great detail, and it wasn't a lawless society. It literally wasn't, because we have written law codes. What's interesting is that you're more likely to be hanged as a thief than you are as a murderer, because theft, particularly of property, was huge, and still is, and always has been. You get children in Victorian times being hanged because they'd stolen. Murder is a little bit different, because essentially the legal system was a sort of a compensation system. So everyone had their price, their worth. The Wergild was the payment that was due if they were killed, and then you had to pay this much in compensation. And the idea is, generally speaking, that if you know this, and you know that your kinsman will be liable for the debt if you can't pay it, it's a way of kind of keeping the violence to a minimum and to stop it escalating. So there weren't a huge amount of stories, and I was able to, all the ones that I found, I was able to at least, briefly mention, even if I couldn't go into full detail. So I don't think I left any out. I mean, there may be some that I didn't find.
Sure.
But there was nothing that I said, oh no, I haven't got room for you. I will just mention this. As I say, some have had more treatment than others. Sometimes it's because we just didn't have the information. There's one story of a murdered nun, and we don't even know where the story originated. So I did mention it, and I went to the church that's dedicated to her, but I couldn't say very much more about it, because we just don't have that information. But the last chapter is also some stories that I collected from Europe and a little bit further afield, just to see, was England really this lawless, murderous place, or were there similar stories? And my goodness, yes,
There was.
in Francia, even worse things were going on. What I didn't have time to do was to verify those sources and to look at the veracity of the stories. So I just detailed the juicy versions of them. But yeah, you've got whole families of brothers wiping each other out and then killing all the sons. And it almost made the English stories look quite tame by comparison. So I think, and that's the thing to bear in mind, again, it's the context that, Anglo-Saxon England wasn't as lawless and murderous as we might think. And also it wasn't that different from what was going on everywhere else at this time. But yeah, it's interesting to compare again, if we fast forward again to the Tudor period, what we don't have anything of in Anglo-Saxon England is any kings beheading or killing their queens. So there's one really tragic tale actually of her, and I do like her story, and I've actually written her into a couple of my novels as well. And she was Northumbrian, part of the royal family of Northumbria, and she married a Mercian king, and it was said she was murdered by the Mercian nobility, but we don't know why. And it's just such a tragic, it's just almost a little sort of footnote in Bede's history of the English peoples, and he mentions that she was killed, but we don't know why. And I just think it's really sad that we don't know what she did or what she was, accused of.
Yeah.
And again, that's another thing. A lot of times with the women, we don't get their names or we don't get the full stories. And actually, a half sister of hers was also accused of killing her Mercian husband. And we don't know the murder weapon. We don't know why. And she's not heard of again. So we don't even know if she was punished. But as I say, sadly, that tends to be the case, because for all the Anglo-Saxons were, I think, a little bit more enlightened is maybe too strong a word. The women did play more of a role in society, and they did have rights and freedoms and privileges. But again, for posterity, a lot of them are just, one sentence, which is sad, but, similar in other periods. So then they're not unusual in that.
Yeah, just footnotes in history, right? It's too bad. Oh, Annie, I've had so much fun talking about this with you today. And I'm fascinated by this time period. I think this is the one time period where I really don't know a whole lot about it. And so it's still very exciting every time I get to read about it and learn more about it. Do you have any suggestions for anybody who's listening right now who wants to get into this period more? Where should they start? Obviously, other than your books, which we're going to promote shortly. Where should someone start if this time period is something that intrigues them?
Oh, gosh. It's really, really difficult to know because obviously most of the books that are on my bookshelf are sort of, more academic text. Find something, a broad history of the Anglo-Saxons, and there are a few out there. One which has been very, very successful is Mark Morris's history of I think it's just called the Anglo-Saxons, and he picks up on individual stories. And I have to say, the stepmother of Edward the Martyr gets a much worse press in his book than she does in mine, because he's convinced that she was in on the plot, and I'm not so sure. So that would be a good place to start. But also, there are really, really good translations of certain of our contemporary sources. So there's a really good, I think it's Penguin Classic translation of Bede's Historia Ecclesiastica, History of the English Peoples, and it's very readable, and there's lots of notes in the back. And similarly, there is a really good translation of Asser's biography of Alfred, and that's edited by Professor Simon Keynes, and it gives lots and lots of background to the life and the times of Alfred the Great. So that would be another really good one. And if you can get hold of a translation of the Anglo-Saxon Chronicles, that goes right from the early days. It's not always contemporary, and it does go way beyond 1066. I mean, I think even into the 12th century. So again, get a good translation of that, and there are plenty out there. And that again, that's the history as it was seen at the time, almost. So that would be another good one. There are other ones. There was the 20th century historian, Sir Frank Stenton, who wrote a really comprehensive history of the whole of the Anglo-Saxon period. And it's really, really good as a starting point. But just remember that it was written in the early mid-20th century, and our understanding and our interpretations of history have changed a little bit since then. But it's again, a really good place to start. And it's available in paperback, very easily accessible. So, yeah.
Perfect. Well, now, of course, you have showcased today your immense knowledge on this time period. So I want you to now tell the readers about your books and what they can find there.
Yeah, so I've written 4 novels, all set in Anglo-Saxon England, mainly in Anglo-Saxon Mercia, which was the big Midland kingdom. My first novel is called To Be a Queen, and that tells the story of Athelflaed, Lady of the Mercians, who a lot of people might know from The Last Kingdom. She was Alfred the Great's daughter. I've written another one slightly later on, talking about that stepmother, that evil stepmother of King Edward, and a leading nobleman at the time who was involved in all this murky goings on, and that's called Alvar the Kingmaker. And then I've written 2 novels about 7th century Mercia and the dealings with Northumbria, and they are Come Up the Hour and The Sins of the Father. And I've got non-fiction books, A History of Mercia, because that Mercia is my love, that's my special interest, and that's Mercia, The Rise and Fall of a Kingdom. And then, as you mentioned earlier, I also wrote Women of Power in Anglo-Saxon England. And I've got this new book coming out, Murder in Anglo-Saxon. I actually have it arrived this week, a copy. So if you can see that.
Oh,
that
exciting.
Is
That's
that's
beautiful.
and this on the cover is, it's a stone engraving, and it actually is supposed to depict the famous or the infamous blood eagle. So that's why the publishers went with that for the cover design.
That is perfect. Well, Annie, if anybody wants to get a hold of you, if they have questions or comments, how can they get a hold of you?
Probably, I mean, I'm all across social media, but if you go to my website, you see all the links there. And my website is anniewhiteheadauthor.co.uk. And you can find all my email contact and Facebook and Twitter, as I still call it, and Instagram, and everything is all on there.
Perfect. Annie, thank you so much for coming on today. This has been such a pleasure. And I want you to know that I'm going to include links in the show notes so that people can find your books as well.
Oh, lovely. Thank you so much for having me on. As you can probably gather, I love to talk about this period of history.
Thank you. And that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. Over there, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, and some patron-exclusive content as well. If you would prefer to show your support in another way, head on over to my website, tudorsdynasty.com, and click on the shop to see some of the new merchandise that I have available. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.